Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is The World This Week. And with us, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet of the Sunday Telegraph, Dave Clark of the French news agency AFP, Harold Hyman of French 24-hour news station BFM TV, and George Kozolias of AITV, our partner station. We're going to talk now about France, where trailing badly in the polls, the incumbent president clearly switching gears. He'd hoped to wait till March. Now aides suggesting he could formally announce his candidacy next week. And in an interview with conservative Le Figaro magazine, Nicolas Sarkozy vows to clamp down even further on immigration and to pledges a referendum to crack down on the unemployed who don't do enough job hunting. So we have a situation where the week began with a definite right tack on the part of Sarkozy. Here he is speaking in the company of the German chancellor who was visiting, standing by his interior minister, who had stated that not all civilizations are on equal footing.
This is one of these ridiculous debates that only politicians can have. The Interior Minister said that a civilization, a regime, a society that doesn't grant the same rights to men and women doesn't have the same value. It's common sense. And if we would just stop debating this, we would save a lot of time.
Just stop debating this. And Elisabeth Moutet, it looks like he's been pushing that agenda slightly, though, on the side.
He's been pushing it much further because Claude Guéant very carefully did not mention any civilization. He just said that they were not all equal. And now he says very clearly, it's much more obvious what he means when he says there's societies that don't give rights to women. And he's targeting the right-wing electorate who may or may not have the opportunity of voting for Marine Le Pen, since we're not quite sure that she can become legally
She's the National Front candidate.
She's the National Front leader. And so these are people who are against immigration and who worry about Islam. So I should say that, yes, it's definitely sort of a hard tack to the right.
And Elisabeth, you also called this a side issue, Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy's new arm candy in a piece you wrote this week. George Kozolias, the pandering to the far-right electorate, as Elisabeth is suggesting, isn't that opening a Pandora's box? Because there was this debate on national identity, and it backfired.
Well, yes, it definitely backfired, and I want to underline that the Prime Minister walked out of Parliament during the questions to the government this week rather than have to answer that question, because he would have either had to distance himself from his Interior Minister or comfort his Interior Minister. And the President is wrong. There is a difference between civilization and regime. You know, and Guéant clearly chose the word civilization. And what I think we have here is good cop, bad cop. But what the Martiniquez member of Parliament said today, this week rather, that this is the kind of...
Let me interrupt you. Let's show the clip. In fact, okay. we can show that an opposition MP from the French Caribbean island of Martinique who accuses the Interior Minister of stoking the spirit of supremacists from the Nazi era.
Vous nous ramenez jour après jour à ces idéologies européennes qui ont donné naissance aux camps de concentration, au bout du long chapelet esclavagiste et colonial. Monsieur Guéant, le régime nazi, si soucieux de purification, était-ce une civilisation?
Mes chers collègues,
la barbarie de l'esclavage dans la colonisation, était-ce une mission civilisatrice? Il existe, monsieur le Premier ministre,
allons, on se calme.
Une France obscure qui cultive la nostalgie de cette époque, que vous tentez de récupérer.
And just after that, the cabinet gets and walks out.
Because the Prime Minister can't answer that question. He, as I said, he either has to distance himself from Guéant, the Interior Minister. No, he was not called a Nazi. He said this vocabulary is the kind of vocabulary that led to the rise of the Nazis. He did not call Claude Guéant a Nazi.
The question is, Mr. Prime Minister, is Nazism a civilization? So that was the exact form of the question.
No, but you're talking to a descendant of a former slave who was enslaved in the name of civilization.
Yes.
And, you know, he has every right to ask the question of where are you going with this vocabulary? Where are you going with pandering to these ideas? These are the ideas that led to the rise of fascism and Nazism.
That is posturing. I think that is as ridiculous from his side as it is from the other side.
The posturing is on the part of Sarkozy's team. We're playing good cop, bad cop to win extreme right-wing votes and at the same time cover the president. That's where the posturing is.
There's another little current here. He was talking, Guéant, the Minister of Interior, was talking to UNI, which is a
right-wing student union.
Yeah, it's pretty deeply right, huh?
And but he wasn't really talking to them. He released a copy of the speech beforehand to the media. He was talking to everybody.
You are quite right.
He used them as the backdrop for that.
Of course.
But they looked for this polemic, and I'm sure they're very happy.
They chose that word deliberately.
Yes, he did. I agree. What he did is he threw in the word civilizations are not equal, and then he threw in the tempering sentence in back. Those that don't have human rights and whatever, all the good things are not equal to those that have the bad things.
But those are regimes.
Absolutely, George, absolutely. So what he did is he substituted the word civilization for regime, and he knew this would happen. Then the guy from Martinique comes back and connects colonialism and slavery to Nazism. Who's going to tell him that he's not allowed to speak about slavery since he's a descendant of slaves? And then he says, is the Nazi regime a civilization? So each one sort of did an overshoot.
Yes.
But it's sure that the stinkier one, in my opinion, is Guéant's stinkiness. But the Letchimy one was a little bit devious.
It's interesting in this, Dave Clark, as an Englishman in Paris, when you're watching this, the French.
It's nice to see a bit of activity in Parliament. That reminds me of home.
But also, whenever they try to broach the subject of history, it doesn't go very well.
Of course, they don't know it.
No, because
they know too much of it, and they use it as badly, but they use it to score points for knowing perfectly well that not very much is going to be heard outside Parliament. I mean, they know perfectly well that they're playing with something that nobody understands.
Marine Le Pen is trying to get 500 signatures. And
to be on the ballot.
To be on the ballot.
Yes.
Of
elected officials.
There's potentially, therefore, around about 16 to 20% of votes in play. And Sarkozy, as it stands, doesn't have a hope. So he needs at least these 16 to 20% of the vote, either in the second round if Marine Le Pen goes out in the first, or hopefully for him in the first round if he doesn't get enough signatures. So they've made the decision this week that they're going to make a play for the far right vote, and it won't hurt them at all with Marine Le Pen supporters if they're getting shouted at by black people in Parliament.
But you'll notice one thing: in the old days, they would play for the National Front with law and order, the policemen, crime in the streets. Now they're picking up much stinkier topics. They are touching civilization and race without saying it.
No one is listening to him anymore in Law and Order. He booked 6 or 7 channels and appeared on TV and didn't make a bang bit of difference to the polls. No one was listening to that story anymore. Needs another story.
All right, and we might see the French president next week on television. He's down by 20 points in the polls for the second round. Election is end of April, beginning of May if there's a runoff. And as for the socialist candidate, he's doing his darndest to stick to his narrative, to keep it about the economy.
We don't need these disagreements and these squabbles. What the country needs is solutions for unemployment, for the cost of living, for health, for housing. These are the subjects which matter for the presidential campaign, not whether one civilization is superior to another.
And yet, final point on this, Annelise Moutet, broaching what Harold just called stinky issues. Is it going to work in the end?
Yes. It's going to work, which is why they're doing it. Yes, it's going to work because there's resentment against immigration in France. Most of the problems that people ascribe to civilization or culture or immigration actually have to do with economics. And since it's going to take time for the economy to be put back on the straight and narrow, and it's going to be difficult. He's got, on the one hand, the educated bourgeoisie, with whom he whips out Angela Merkel, and he says the only way to reduce the debt and to keep our rating is to do this. And then he's got the people, and the people that's going to work because it's very popular.
His only problem is that a lot of those unemployed are French.
And they will vote for him. They think they're unemployed because somebody else took their jobs. It's sad, but it's true.
All right, we're going to move across the channel. There were 2 very British milestones this past week. Let's talk about the first, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne. And despite appearances, it wasn't really marked with much of a bang. Although here you see the scene outside of Buckingham Palace. No, instead, the Queen quietly marked the occasion by visiting a nursery school near her Sandringham estate. It's interesting because hers is the most reproduced face on the planet, more than the Pope, since her portrait's on coins and bills on 3 continents. A most public figure, but she's never granted a public interview, and we can only speculate about her personal views on politics. We don't know what she actually thinks.
We don't know. What we do know is that she has had the best possible training. She's had training beforehand with constitutional experts, and since she's the last monarch who was homeschooled as opposed to her son who went to university. But also she's had training on the job. She had 12 prime ministers, starting with Churchill and all the way to David Cameron, and with Margaret Thatcher, Callaghan, Wilson, and she has spoken with them all, and they all acknowledge that she made some very interesting points. She has a constitutional role. She's very aware of it. She's got one thing near to her heart that we know about, and it's the Commonwealth. And we know perfectly well that whenever there was a feeling that Britain was forgetting, especially in budget debates, the Commonwealth, the Queen felt very strongly about this. So I suspect that she would be described as a wet Tory, a sort of more liberal wing of the Tory party, more than anything else. Somebody with a social conscience. She is the leader of the Arab Church of England. And we have a fair notion of what she actually believes in, but she also believes in her responsibility to the nation. And the other thing is that even though the rest of the royal family is actually not terribly popular in Great Britain, she is hugely popular. Everybody respects her work ethic and the fact that apparently she hasn't put a foot wrong.
Dave Clark, if you get that first interview with the Queen, what would you be asking her?
Well, I'd like to know more about her relationships with the Prime Ministers down the years. I understand she liked some of them, didn't like others, and to what extent constitutionally she can make that known. And as a British person living abroad, I've never been a strong royalist per se, and some members of her family have behaved fairly disgracefully over the past few centuries. But having said that, as a Britishman living abroad, I quite like the idea of having a head of state who's above the kind of ridiculous debates we've seen recently in France and in the United States. Countries with executive presidents haven't had a very good record. The United States constitution may have held together, but generally speaking, if you look at countries with executive presidents, they're some of the worst regimes in the world.
All right, we're not going to discuss the U.S. primary race this week. There's the other milestone, Charles Dickens, whose novels accompany the upheaval of Britain's Industrial Revolution, turning 200 years old this week. At 200, does he still resonate? Let's ask by finding out from our panel which of Dickens's works matter most to you. Harold Hyman.
Well, in my memory, there are two. It's Great Expectations and A Tale of Two Cities. What's remarkable about them both is that that's what they made us read. Since we went to the same school, you probably were dealt the same hand. They had nothing to do with social issues, or very, very little. But Great Expectations would be, it sort of appeals to a child, because it's about a child. And The Tale of Two Cities, because of the French Revolution backdrop, which we knew from another side, and unfortunately, we never were given novels about the French Revolution, historical novels. So in A Tale of Two Cities, you sort of do recall how the carriage of the Marquis runs over a kid in the street, and the Marquis just tosses the coin. And that's sort of the symbol of what the old regime was in my head. So he gave me that idea of the aristocracy
looking at the French Revolution
over
from
the vermin and not caring.
From a different perspective. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet.
I would also say A Tale of Two Cities, because it's about the revolution, the hopes of the revolution, and the revolution eventually eating its young. And it's because it's in the beginning, it's all about the horrors of the old regime, or parts of the horrors of the old regime. It's more nuanced. And then it is about the horrors of the revolution itself and the hero. And I love the fact that it's got two heroes. It's got this sort of blameless young aristocrat who's a good guy and who's slightly boring. And then it's got his doppelganger in many ways because they look alike. Sidney Carton, the English lawyer, who is a barrister. He is a scoundrel in some ways. He smokes, he drinks, and eventually he makes an extremely noble and selfless choice to the end. I'm not going to spoil the novel for the 2.5 people who haven't read it, but I find this wonderful. I also find it wonderful that this is Thomas Carlyle's view of the French Revolution made a novel and given life, and Dickens himself said that he owed everything to Carlyle. And people say, why do you read novels? We read novels because otherwise we do not know really what life was at a period. And the 19th century invents the modern novel, and in Britain you've got a trio who were born within 5 years. That's Thackeray, Dickens, Thackeray, and Trollope. Trollope is born in 1815, Dickens is born in 12, Thackeray is born in 11, and they are the equivalent of what we have in France, Balzac, Flaubert, and Stendhal.
And
Zola?
And Zola's later.
That's later.
George Cazolis?
Hard times. Hard times. Maybe just because I'm a dreamer, to quote Lenin, and I mean John Lennon, not Vladimir, but it's an indictment of the 1%. It's an indictment of the 1%. And let's not forget, Charles Dickens was one of the first muckrakers. Exposing
he was a journalist.
He was exposing and this is at the time of William Russell, who was going to bring down a government because of the way that they covered the Crimean War.
Dave Clark.
Bleak House, because I've gone to a lot of financial summits recently, and spoiler alert, they argue for a very, very long book about inheritance, and as the Greeks are about to find out, there was no money left at the end.
And there's no time left at the end either. We're unfortunately going to have to leave it there. Dave Clark, I want to thank you. I want to thank George Cazolis and Elisabeth Moutet, Harold Hyman, and thank you for being with us here for The World This Week.